before I understood what this was calling itself, before I had the language to contain it. I felt it move through everything I thought was certain, and recognized it had already claimed it. Every part I thought belonged to measured reason, every corner that I kept for the composed, was already occupied by something older, a fire moving in before I'd noticed it had grown. And I stood at the edge of knowing, at the threshold of the named, with everything inside me showing, a fire without claim, a fire with no name, burns longer than the labeled kind, a fire with no name, moves past the borders of the mind. It doesn't ask for definition, it doesn't need a word to spread. A fire with no name is everything that I have never said. I tried the standard vocabulary of devotion, tried fitting what I feel into the old containers, but every word I reached for came back hollow, each label just another way of feigning. Because what lives inside me when you're near me is not the ordinary catalog of love. It is more fundamental, more primordial, more like something rising from below and not above. And I stand at the edge of knowing, at the threshold of the named, with everything inside me showing, a fire without claim. The men who name things early keep them smaller. The naming is a boundary and a frame, and what I feel has always been too honest, too wide, too deep to fit inside a name. So let it burn unnamed and uncontained. Let it be exactly what it is, the fullest, most inarticulate devotion a man can carry. And it carries his, a fire with no name, burns longer than the labeled kind, a fire with no name has lived in me since long before I tried to hold it or to measure it or frame it, to reduce it to a simpler claim, the most complete thing that I have ever carried, a fire burning brilliant without name. took the long way back to you. Not because the short way wasn't there, but because the long way asked me questions that a man can only answer in the open air. Of all the years between the leaving and the finding, of all the distance that it took to understand, I took the long way back to you and arrived a different, more complete man. I left before I understood the leaving, before I knew the weight of what I chose. I was younger and I thought that moving forward meant moving past the things that mattered most. But moving past does not mean moving over. The past is not a threshold you can cross. It follows with the patience of a witness and shows you every overlooked and buried loss. I went through everything the years assembled, through everyone who held the temporary place, and not a single moment in between them replaced the particular warmth of what we faced. Settled in the same way. Nothing else required so little performance. Nothing else made me feel so simply okay. And the long way was not wasted. Every wrong direction taught direction. Every person I had moved beside mistakenly sharpened my appreciation and affection for the fit of two people simply fitting, without the labor of adjustment and pretend. The long way brought me back with full conviction that you were always where the long way is. I took the long way back to you, not because the short way wasn't clear, but because I needed all the distance to be certain of the reason I am here. And every year of separation was instruction. Every absence was a study in your worth. I took the long way back to you, and I am not leaving. Not again, not first. I entered this with modest expectations, prepared myself for something I could handle. told myself that I would keep the margins, keep the self intact, keep the candle at a measured distance from the feeling, far enough to see it not to burn. But it was deeper than I planned, deeper than the depth I thought I'd earned. And the deeper I descended into caring, the less the surface rules applied. Because care does not observe prepared limits, and love has never honored what you hide. I found myself at latitudes of feeling that no prior map had ever shown. It was deeper than I planned, deeper than the man I thought I'd known. In myself, that is where I found the surprise. Not in you, you were exactly what you were. The surprise was in the man who was receiving, and how much more he had in him to stir. He had capacity he had not visited, rooms inside himself he'd never entered, and you became the reason that he went there. Deeper than he'd ever been or centered, deeper than I planned, deeper than the distance I selected, deeper than the version of myself I thought could go this far and still feel free. Deeper than I planned, deeper than a decade of composure, deeper than the man I call protected, deeper than I thought that I could be. And I do not regret the depth, I only regret the years I spent refusing it. The years I stood at manageable distances and called the shallow waters choosing it. The depth is where the real things live. The depth is where a man becomes entirely. And I arrived here deeper than I planned, and this is where I mean to stay, sincerely. We spoke more in our silences than language ever carried. I understood that later, long after the language ended, when I sat inside the remnant of a conversation that had never actually been attended to with words. We were fluent in the unspoken, in the held breath before decision, in the particular quality of quiet that exists between two people in collision with something true. Every silence was a word, every pause a full confession, every held breath carried meaning past the reach of language's expression. And I became so practiced in that language that when words returned they felt like translation, a rougher, less precise version of the feeling, a necessary but imperfect approximation. I remember the exact quality of quiet that preceded every moment of importance, as clearly as I recall the actual language, with more accuracy and more accordance. Every silence was a word, every pause a full confession, every held breath carried meaning past the reach of language's expression. And what I miss is not the conversation, it is the fluency we built in what surrounds it, the specific kind of silence that we mastered, and the warmth and weight of everything that grounds it. Two people who had learned to mean without speaking, who had built a grammar out of what is felt. That language is the one I still am holding, that is the one that left me with the hand I'm dealt. I have tried to speak that language since with others, have listened for the kind of quiet that we shared. But fluency like that is built through seasons, through years of choosing each other, being there. And silence is not silence when it's empty, it is only silence when it speaks. And what we shared was never empty silence, it was the fullest version. Silence reaches of two people, meaning everything without a single word. I am made of what remains after leaving, of the parts that did not fold or fall away, of the love that went unanswered but persisted, of the truth that chose to stay. I am made of every honest conversation that I had with only myself at the close of day, of the morning that I moved through without hardening, of the warmth I chose to wait. Made of what remains, not what was taken. Made of what survives the season and the loss. Made of what remains, not what was broken, but the part that kept its shape and bore the cost. Made of what remains, and I am richer for the having than I was before the losing came to call. Made of what remains, entirely assembled from the best that I recovered from the fall. I am made of every lesson that arrived unbidden, that I swallowed before knowing what I learned, of the tenderness I carried past the ending, of the care I never earned. I am made of all the waiting that was fruitless, that I maintained because the waiting felt like truth, of the version of myself that kept on opening long past the obvious proof. Because what a man is made of is not circumstance, not the shape of what was given or removed. It is what he chose to carry past the ending, and what the carrying itself has proved, that he can hold the beautiful and bitter without confusing one for what it's not. And what he has assembled from experience is not what he has lost, it's what he's got. Made of what remains, of the love that would not harden, of the hope that outlasted every argument against. Made of what remains, of the man who kept on caring, even when the caring made no obvious sense. Made of what remains. There are entire conversations I rehearsed and swallowed, entire declarations pressed against the inside of my teeth. I became fluent in the art of almost speaking, and masterful at holding what lived underneath. Not from absence of the feeling, let me be precise. The feeling was abundant and articulate and clear, but the speaking of it made it irrevocable. And irreversible things require a different kind of courage here. And so I withheld the tenderness in portions, fed you measured pieces of a larger whole. Told myself that caution was a form of caring, when caution was the cage I'd built around the soul. But what a man withholds does not diminish. It accumulates with interest and with weight. And all I thought I was protecting carefully was simply what I left too long, too late. So here is everything I never handed over. Every honest word I kept inside the hell. Every declaration that expired in silence. Every part of me that suffered being withheld. I loved you more completely than I showed. I wanted you more fully than I said. I needed you in ways I called unnecessary, and kept the truest versions in my head. And I am older now, and I am clearer. The withholding was not wisdom, it was fear. And what I failed to give you in full measure is the most significant thing I leave from here. All that I withheld was all I should have said. All that I withheld was all I kept instead of living, of arriving, of the honest man. All that I withheld was everything I am. A man can be confused about what strength requires, can mistake the hard exterior for the thing itself, can spend so many years performing self-sufficiency that he forgets the feeling on the shelf. The feeling that was there before the armor, the one that breathed before the posture set, the one that could be moved with without permission, the one that has not fully hardened yet. The softest part of strength is where the real man lives, beyond the held together and composed. The softest part of strength is what survives the long resistance, is what remains when all the walls are closed. That it is not a weakness to be tender, it is the bravest thing a man can bring. The softest part of strength is everything. And you found that part without looking for it. You simply treated me as something more than the constructed version that I offered. And what was underneath came to the fore. Not because I chose it, it chose outward. Moved toward you before I could instruct. And everything I'd called my independence turned out to be the house of the construct. With a name, the softest part of strength is where you found me, past the man I'd practiced being well. The softest part of strength is what you recognized before I had the courage to reveal. And it is not a weakness to be tender, it is the truest offering a man can bring. The softest part of strength is everything. How long can a man sustain the distance between the wanting and the actual reach? How long before the argument for caution collapses into something out of reach? A reasoning beyond the structured logic that kept the feeling in its careful place. How long before the distance becomes dishonest and the honesty demands a different face? I remember choosing distance as a virtue, believing space was something that protected. I thought the gap between the feeling and the acting was where a man stayed safe and unaffected. But safe from what? From love, from being needed, from the particular ache of being known. The distance was not shelter, it was exile, and I had called it choosing to be alone. Running out of distance, running out of space between the real and the declared, running out of arguments for staying in the comfortable remove of being scared. Running out of patience with the posture, running out of reasons for the help, running toward the one thing that was waiting past everything I'd withheld. Running out of distance now, the gap is closing whether or not I move. Running out of distance now, and what lies at the end of it is true. Running out of distance means arriving at the place I have been moving toward for long. Running out of distance, running out of everything that kept me from belonging. And so I let the distance have its ending, let the gap between the feeling and the set close down. Because a man who runs out of his distance has finally stopped running, he has found the only destination that was ever real, the only place the years were always pointed toward. The end of all the distance is arrival, and arrival is the most I could afford. First I stopped pretending I was fine. That was the outermost and easiest surrender. The performance of contentment at the surface, the practice calm that had grown thin and slender. I let that go on an unremarkable evening, without ceremony and without announcement. And what was left beneath it was more honest than anything I'd worn with less pronouncement. I stopped pretending that I didn't want the kind of closeness that I'd called unnecessary. I had dressed it up in language about freedom, had made an ideology of being solitary. But solitary is not the same as chosen, and freedom is not always what it's named. And when the pretending stopped, I stood inside, the warning that I practiced being ashamed. When the pretending stops, everything is simpler and more frightening. When the pretending stops, the air is colder and the feeling brightening all at once. When the pretending stops, the man who's left is raw than he planned, but more himself than any version, with a strategy in hand. Then I stopped pretending that I didn't love. That was the innermost and final layer. The hardest thing to stand without the covering, the thing that needed neither judge nor prayer. Just acknowledgement, direct and without softening. Just a full arrival at the fact. I loved you in the way that changes people, and the pretending was the last thing keeping that intact. When the pretending stops, what's left is what was always there beneath it. When the pretending stops, the truth is not a choice. You simply feel it all the way. When the pretending stops, the man who stands before you is complete. Everything surrendered, everything revealed, everything delivered. When love departs, it does not leave the body cleanly. It does not take everything it brought. It leaves behind the parts that it has altered, the rewired ways of feeling and of thought. I am not the same man that existed before the particular love that came and went. And what was left behind is not a ruin. It is the most intentional thing love meant. It lent me a way of seeing that I have kept past the duration of the source, and I have valued it in its aftermath as deeply as I valued it along its its original course. What love leaves behind is not the absence, though absence comes and makes itself at home. What love leaves behind is the expansion of a man who now knows how to not be alone. Even in the literal alone, even solo, even in the quietest internal space, he carries the capacity for closeness that love installed in time cannot erase. What love leaves behind is not a wound, it is a wider opening than the man possessed before. What love leaves behind is not a scar, it is the proof that something reached the core. And what was reached does not return to smaller, does not compress back to its former size. What love leaves behind is the inheritance of having loved with fully open eyes. And I am grateful for the leaving as much as for the having that took time to understand that loss is not pure subtraction, it leaves behind a different kind of prime. A readiness, a tenderness, a certainty about what matters, that I would not trade for the untouched, unentered version of myself that came before. What love leaves behind is the truest gift, the one that stays when everything else fades. What love leaves behind is who you are when what you loved has finally been repaid. With gratitude, honest and complete, with the recognition that it made you real. What love leaves behind is everything you needed to understand exactly what you feel. There is a man I never introduced you to, not the one who answered when you called, not the one who occupied the visible, but the one who lived behind the wall. He was quieter and softer than the offered version, more uncertain and more easily undone. He was the one who wanted more than anything to simply be enough for someone. I kept him back because I thought you'd find him less substantial than the one you came to know. I thought the composed man was more deserving of the kind of love I wanted you to show. But the composed man is a careful imitation of the real thing, standing several steps behind. And the man I kept from you was more worth loving than the version I allowed you to find. The man I kept from you was the one who needed most. The man I kept from you was not the one who held the post of certainty and steadiness and managed. He was the one who trembled at the real. The man I kept from you was the only one I feel. I kept his fear of being left from you entirely. Never let you see how much your staying meant. Performed a self-sufficiency so thorough that you never knew the depth of what it spent. To keep the distance just enough for comfort, keep the need just under what was shown. And the man I kept from you stood watching every moment that I chose to stand alone. He is here now, standing where the armor used to be, no longer introduced through the composed version, no longer filtered through the man I tried to be. He is the one who loved you past the ending. He is the one who loves you still somehow. He is the man I kept from you entirely. He is the only man I'll offer now. The man I kept from you is all I have. The man I kept from you is everything I am. He arrives perhaps too late, but arrives complete for the first time whole. For the first time, free.
I have been faithful to the feeling in the years when faith was difficult to hold, in the seasons when the feeling had no language, in the winters when the wanting felt too cold. I have maintained been tainted past every good reason to replace it with something easier to bear. And the faithfulness has not been without cost, but the cost has never made me less aware of what it is, the feeling and its value, and how much of what I am depends upon the faithfulness I offered it completely. Through every season it was forced to carry on. I have spoken for the feeling in the silence, given it my patience and my time, carried it through every contradiction, made it the one constant in the climb of everything that changes and dismantles, every certainty that came apart with age. The feeling is the one thing I have honored, the one commitment I have kept across the page. Faithful to the feeling, past the doubt and past the drain. Faithful to the feeling, past the reason to explain. Faithful to the feeling, not from stubbornness or pride, but because the feeling is the truest thing that has ever lived inside. And faithfulness is not the passive habit, it is a daily act of choosing what is real. It is the declaration made each morning that I will not trade what I truly feel for comfort or convenience, or the simpler, for anything that wears a smaller name. Faithful to the feeling means arriving at the same truth every time I came. I am faithful to the feeling that began the moment you arrived. I am faithful to the feeling that has not diminished, it has thrived. Past every test that tested it completely, past every argument that made against. The feeling stands as it has always stood, the most faithful and the most immense thing I have ever chosen to become. Faithful, still faithful, always faithful to the feeling, to you. There are mornings when the grief arrives first, before the day has opened or assembled, before a single reasonable thought has gathered. It is simply there, the weight of what resembled. Everything I wanted most and lost. It does not announce itself, it simply settles in the space across from me, habitual, familiar and precise in all its details. But inside the same breath that carries the grief is something that I can only call the grateful. The recognition that to grieve at this depth is evidence of something truly fateful and beautiful, that I was capable of this, that I found the kind of love worth grieving over, that I was the kind of man who felt this fully before the feeling asked me to recover. Between the grief and the grateful is where I make my home. Between the grief and the grateful is where I am less alone than anywhere that doesn't hold both truths simultaneously real. Between the grief and the grateful is the most honest thing I feel. Grief knows things that gratitude cannot. It knows the shape of what is missing precisely. It carries the dimensions of the absence and will not let me minimize them nicely. And I have stopped trying to resolve it. Stop reaching for the version where it ends, because the grief is keeping something for me, something that the gratitude depends upon. The proof of full engagement, the evidence that I was truly there, that I brought everything I had to what we were, and that I loved with actual care. Not the careful kind that hedges against loss, not the measured kind that keeps the reserves full, but the total kind that leaves you with the grief and the gratitude in equal pull. And I sit in the space between them, let them both complete their honest testimony, because a man who only knows the grateful has loved something less than what I've known, and a man who only carries grief has forgotten what he's been given between the grief and the grateful. I am holy alive. That is the beginning and the ending. I have wanted you since long before I said it. I carried it through every careful silence, and I am done with the silence. I'll not credit restraint with any more nobility than it deserves. Restraint was cowardice dressed up in patience. And what I feel is simple and is urgent and deserves more than performance and discretion. That exists between us, more than anything my pride would let me name. And I name it now without the softening, without the cover of appropriate and tame. I'm not made for the managed and the partial, not built for giving fractions of myself. What I have to give is total and is honest, and I am done with leaving it upon the shelf. Honest to the bone, no version dressed for comfort or occasion. Honest to the bone, no distance and no managed presentation. This is what I am.
This is what I am. This is what I feel.
This is the most complete and undefended version of me that has ever been this real. Acceptable. Enough time making the enormous sound appropriate and the immediate sound manageable. This is not manageable. This is not appropriate sized. This is the full scale of what I carry, delivered to you unreduced, unsurprised, by its own depth, by its own demand, honest to the bone, exactly as I am, honest to the bone. No calibration for expected reception, honest to the bone. Beyond performance and beyond protection. This is what I bring.
This is what I bring.
This is what is real. The most unguarded delivery of everything I feel. Honest to the bone, to you. with the wide-eyed disbelief of being chosen. They loved you with a wonder not yet tempered, with a faith in the feeling not yet frozen. By experience, they were pure and astonished, and every day of them arrived like a first morning. The early years loved you without knowing how much the loving would outlast its warning. The middle years loved you with a deeper register, with the knowing that comes after the beginning. When the wonder settles into something steadier, and love becomes a practice, not a winning. The middle years loved you through the testing, through every passage where the feeling proved itself. And what survived the testing was more solid than anything that lived on Wonder Shelf. The years that loved you are the years that made me. The years that loved you shaped everything I am. The years that loved you were not separate from living. They were the living, every one of them, part of the plan of what a man becomes when he has loved this long. The years that loved you are the years I carry forward as my song. The later years loved you with a tenderness that only comes from having love through time, with the gratitude of knowing what was given, and the understanding that it was sublime. Not in the grand sense, in the true sense, in the sense that it was real and it was deep. And the later years loved you with the wisdom that what a man has loved is what he'll keep inside him permanently, beyond the duration of the love itself, beyond the end. The later years loved you knowing this completely, and loved you for it without pretend. In the years ahead, whatever they may carry, will love you in the only way they can, through the shape that all the other years have given to the feeling. And the man. chose you in the moments no one witnessed, in the private catalog of decision, where nothing is performed. I chose you, not in the grand gestures, but in the ordinary choices, where the real choosing is done. I chose you when it would have been simpler to maintain the comfortable distance. I chose you when the argument for caution was louder than my own resistance. I chose you in the space before the morning, when the self is most honest and alone. I chose you in the honest middle of my doubting, when the choosing had the most to overcome. I chose you quietly, without announcement and without occasion. I chose you quietly before decision became a declaration. The quiet choosing is the real one. It happens underneath the stated and the known. I chose you quietly, and that is not a lesser way of being shown. And I will keep choosing in the same manner, in the ways that never make it to the spoken, in the small repeated decisions of devotion, in the ways that prove a thing before it's broken. Because the quiet choosing is not absence, it is the most consistent form of there. It is the choosing that does not need witnessing. It is the choosing done because you care. Most declarations are performed just once, offered to the moment with full witness. But the choosing that I bring to you is daily, renewed each time without the need for fitness, without ceremony, without announcement, just the quiet turn of a man back toward the one thing he keeps choosing, past the moment and the plan. I chose you quietly, I choose you still, in every silent decision, in every act of will that goes unnamed, that goes unseen, that simply is the choosing of the space between us and what it means. was a period I cannot name precisely, when everything moved past without arriving, when the days were technically completed, but nothing in them felt like actual living. I moved through what was required with competence. I answered everything that asked for answers, but the deeper room was locked, and I had lost the awareness of what lived beyond those chambers. And then something, I cannot say exactly what, something at the margin of a moment suggested that the locked room had a draft beneath the door, the faintest evidence of something potent, still living behind what I had sealed and closed, still present in what I had called abandoned, still carrying the capacity for fullness in a chest I thought was permanently stranded. The return of feeling is not a welcome, it is a reckoning. The return of feeling is not warmth before the wondering. What do I do with all of this again? What do I do with being full? The return of feeling finds a man both grateful and unsettled in the pool. And you were part of what the draft was carrying. Your presence was what moved beneath the door. Not the cause, I wanna be precise, the occasion, the reason that I opened what I'd closed before. Because feeling needs a reason to return, needs something worth arriving for and into. And what I found waiting on the other side was the particular enormity of you. You put away, it comes with all the years of the unfelt, demanding to be felt without delay. And I sat inside the flood of the returning of everything the locked room had sustained. And what I felt was not relief exactly, it was something larger, something that remained. The return of feeling is what I am. The return of feeling is where you began in me, in the place that thought itself unable. The return of feeling proved me wrong. There are things between us that have not been finished, conversations that arrived at no conclusion, questions that we set aside for later, that were never answered. only left in suspension. And I have carried them the way you carry something that has neither weight nor remedy, something that refuses to be either released or held. It simply stays with me. I do not know if this is what you'd call unfinished, or if some things are simply not designed for ends. If the unsettled is a kind of honest living, rather than a wound that never mends. Because the things that are too real for resolution are the things that carry most of what was true. And everything left unsettled between us is the most precise accounting of what I knew. Everything left unsettled is not failure, it is proof. Everything left unsettled is the unedited and permanent truth of what we were before the editing, before the version that the distance made. Everything left unsettled is everything that could not be erased. And I have made my peace with its persistence, have learned to live beside what will not close, have learned that resolution is not always available, and what remains is not always what decomposes. It can be the opposite. It can be what endures. It can be the realest inventory of everything that was entirely yours. And so I leave it. Everything left unsettled, standing in the space it has always held, not forcing it toward meaning or toward ending, not demanding it be clearly spelled. Some things deserve to remain as questions. Some truths are permanent in their uncertainty. And everything left unsettled between us is the most honest place I have ever been. There is more inside me than I defended, more than the controlled exterior contained, more than the composed and measured offering, more love than I maintained. The distance I constructed was a fraction of the whole. The rest was always yours. But the rest lived in the parts I was protecting, behind whatever I was performing for. And the performance was convincing, I'll admit that. Even to myself it sometimes passed for real. But underneath the competent exterior was a man who could not account for what he'd feel. Every time you were near him, every time the space between you closed to nothing, every time he felt the particular warmth of you and had to pretend it wasn't something, he was feeling more than he defended, more than the language of sufficiency allowed, more than the version he presented for inspection could hold without breaking through the shroud. He was full in every room he kept shuttered, overflowing in the parts he called composed. He was carrying more love than any distance could contain once the real account was disclosed. Oh, more than I defended is what was always there. More than I defended is what I could not spare from being the entire truth of what I feel. More than I defended is the most that I am. Every part of me that lived past the ideal of the managed and the held and withheld man. And here it comes, everything that lived behind the boundary, everything I kept contained and called controlled, everything that was too large for the constructed, everything that was too honest for the fame. Here it comes, past every wall I credited with wisdom, past every measured gesture I arranged. Here it comes, the full account, the real thing. More than I defended, more than I had claimed. I could feel more than I defended is what I give you now. More than I defended, past the why and past the how. This is the undefended, this is what arrived. This is more than I defended. This is where I've lived inside. I have been the man who almost left, the man who stood at thresholds and reconsidered, the man who felt the pull of the familiar distance and chose the other thing, the thing that delivered. him further in, further toward the honest, further past the comfortable remove. And every time the choosing went towards staying was the most significant thing I chose to prove. Staying is not passive, let me say that clearly. It is not the absence of another action. It is its own decision made repeatedly, with the full weight of deliberate attraction to what is real, to what is here, to what is worthy of the presence of a man who means to be. Not half arrived, not managing the margin, but entirely, completely, wholly free to be exactly where he chose to be. A man who stays is not a man who settled. A man who stays is not a man without a choice. A man who stays chose every day the staying and gave the choosing his full weight and voice. A man who stayed became the truest version of everything believing could not build. A man who stayed found out that what he came back to was worth more than anything the going filled. I have known the distance, I have lived it fully, have worn it like a second nature for long years. And what I brought back from it was the knowledge that the leaving only clears a space for asking what the leaving solved, and finding that the answer is not much. That what remained after the distance widened was the wanting of a particular touch, of belonging, of the kind that is not abstract, of the real, the specific, the exact, the belonging to a person and a feeling, and the choosing to go back. So I am a man who stayed, not from running out of somewhere else to go, but from understanding what the staying meant, from wanting what the staying could bestow, which is everything, which is the full account, which is the life that happens when a man decides the depth is worth the full amount of his presence and his truth and his entirety. A man who stayed built something from the choosing. A man who stayed found out that choosing builds. A man who stayed learned everything the distance could not teach him, and the leaving never filled. A man who stayed is the man I finally became, past the almost, and the managed and defended, past the distance and the exile and the shame. A man who stayed arrived, and I am here, and I will keep on choosing. The only place that ever felt like home was not a place at all. It was the feeling of a man who finally